Hello and welcome back to the Coachlogik podcast. I'm your host, Max Ada, joined not in person this week, but in spirit, in in presence by Joshua Gibson. Josh, how you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. Ever since you called me Giggling Gibson, I realized I do laugh quite a bit, which I don't think is a bad thing. I
Yeah,
think I just find a lot of stuff humorous.
yeah, yeah. I can see that. I can see that.
Maybe it's to break awkward
There you
silence like
go. There, case in point. Case in point. Uh, But I think today, a bit more of a serious topic, Josh. We're going to delve into the world of specific training blocks. We talked about general training phases. We talked about hypertrophy training a bit earlier. Uh, but now time to go to the dance. They say that's what they say in Montana. It's we're headed to the barn to do a hoedown. You've got to get hyper specific. Josh, what would you define as a specific block of training? And maybe more broadly, what are the specific phase of training? What does that look like?
yeah, I think that's a great question, and that's one thing I wanted to comment is that I think a lot of people look forward to specific blocks of training. I think this is kind of where you get the best intersection of pushing strength work, starting to ramp up intensity in some of the classic lifts or their variations. I think we start to get into what feels like weightlifting training. And not that like a general block doesn't, it's just, if you're doing sets of, 4 to 8 in the strength work or strength focused exercise or hypertrophy focused exercises, and then you're doing maybe more doubles and triples in the classic lifts or close variations. You have more variety. You're seeing a little bit less variation between sessions in terms of kind of like average intensity within exercises. Everything feels a little more like we're building capacity, we're building this ability to do something great, and then you start to realize that in more specific blocks of training. So for me, this is where I start to push close variations, ramp up the intensity with those, and see like, okay, the work we've put in the last 4 to 6 to 8 weeks, what's that culminating into? Have we done our job, basically, like the work we put in beforehand to make technical changes, make some physiological like adaptations, if we want to distinguish those. Is that, when push comes to shove, did we do a good job? And then the strength work is going to see this intensification across time, to where we might actually be pushing some singles in, say, a back squat, front squat, squat variations. We might be pushing singles in the poles based on what we're trying to develop. So everything starts to come to a head, and we get a nice gut check. And broadly, that's what it's going to look like. And I mean, I could give you more like specifics, like it might be 2 to 5 reps or 2 to 6 reps. You might see percentages from, say, 70 to 90%. More medium to high volumes. It's not going to reach peak values like we did in the general block, but we're also not trying to really unload the work we've developed the capacity to handle. And then we're starting to really see, okay, when we make this pivot into a competition block, or if we're going to do multiple strength blocks, we need to set ourselves up. So we're getting ready for this transition to something slightly different.
Yeah, I think the most obvious difference between specific training phases and I guess we would really just call these like special prep or really like pre-competition phases or the competition phase. Depending on what school of thought you're in, or I don't know what probably like Dane Miller calls it, the who knows, the unicorn magic phase. Um, but just to give a little dig to Dane. But yeah, it's like the end of the training phase. End of the training cycle culminates in a period of time where we need to ratchet up the exposure to the most specific means and methods so that we can realize the adaptations we've had earlier in the cycle in a way that is meaningful in the competition, right? So the most simple, approach to this is to go from more extensive, more general means like we had earlier in the training cycle to more intensive, more specific, means, methods, so sets, reps, intensities, exercises. The way in which we do this is pretty broad, but it's probably at all phases the phase and the block type that is most similar across the board, right? If you were to take a let's say a Lasha and a 49 kilo, let's say uh, you know Cambay or something from Romania. Like those two athletes in the general phase of training, their programs are going to look most different. There's going to be the most disparity between them because they both have potentially very different needs to remedy any issues they've got, technical weaknesses, strength imbalances, whatever it is. But as you get closer and closer to the competition, when we get into this highly specific phase, those programs are going to look very similar because the requirement of what they have to do is so similar. I mean, it's identical. They have to lift maximum weights in the snatch, clean and jerk, or if you're a power lifter, squat, bench, deadlift. Like you have to express exactly the thing you're trying to do in competition. So knowing that, we know that those phases are going to look similar. We also know that the general structure of them is going to be similar as well because we have a definitive end date, and that end date is the competition. So if two athletes are competing towards the European Championships or towards Raw Nationals, they're going to move their training more and more in line as they get closer to that because there's there's the same kind of processes that need to take place. There's the overall goals of those blocks are very similar with very similar timelines. So you're going to look really similar. So that's why like these peaking phases or these pre-comp phases or competition block is going to look very similar across the board. That being said, what I would add is that there should still be an element. If we say like out of 100% of your training volume, let's say 80% of it becomes hyper specific, as in, you're doing the competition movements near maximum intensities with, a decaying of volume as you progress towards the meet. Maybe 20% of that volume is still dedicated or allocated to, maintenance of remedial things, right? So maintenance of, your ability to tolerate training volume or maintenance of, some muscle mass you built earlier or some particular exercise that has a strong impact on your technique. Let's say, for example, like safety bar squats really just make you that much better in the bottom of the squat for whatever reason. And when you're in the program, you feel a better tactile connection to the squat. So like, it's not that we only do hyper specific stuff. It's just that the proportion of it is far outweighs everything else. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that was a great overview, and you also made a great point. I think this is kind of where people might get a little confused sometimes, and it's mostly a language barrier, right? Even you mentioning like a special prep or specific prep or pre-comp prep,
Our non-English speaking guests.
They think like, oh, weightlifting programs, if it's more based on this or based on that, they're going to look wildly different. It's like, no, I mean, at some point they converge, and all this, the way I kind of can abstractly conceptualize it is similar to a funnel. Towards the front end, there's going to be the most variability with the widest opening, which has the most room for different whatever training inputs really to be pieced together. And then as you kind of get to more of the middle phases of prep and then closer to competition, things tighten up so much more that, yeah, peaking phases like actual competition blocks or competitive blocks of training, and then pre-competition blocks or specific blocks of training start to look similar. And the nuance or the difference really is in the magnitude, right? It's in the formulation and the magnitude. So it's like the dose of stress, and then it's how you piece together and I guess like partition that stress. And you can do a better and worse job. I mean, imagine we had all of the same training variables, all the same sets and reps, same total volume, same intensities. We had every single piece of a training program that we wanted to use, and then we just applied it in 15 different ways, I mean, you get 15 different results, or like you'd get different adaptations
Yeah.
to the same stress. Because imagine you took all that volume and did it in one day. It's obviously going to be ineffective. Okay, well, what about 2 days? Like, well, it's the same thing. It's ineffective. And then as you get to,
I have a good story about that.
sure,
I have a good story about that. Yeah. For those of you in the weightlifting sphere, you'll remember a pretty decent athlete from California Strength, Rob Blackwell. And Rob told me one time he had a client, like a brand new young lady who was training with him, and so she was pretty like inexperienced as far as like the how to like train and what's normal. So like she didn't have a good handle on what's a program supposed to look like on a particular day. And he told me, he's like, yeah, I gave her, bless his heart, I gave her the base Smolov first 3 weeks, first 3 weeks of the Smolov program, which is really all anyone ever does anyways, because the rest of the program's terrible. The whole thing's terrible. But so he gave her this program, this 3-week program, which is like, if those not familiar with Smolov, it's a made up program that probably, who knows if it really came from Russia or not, but it's like 4 days a week of squatting. Each day is somewhere in the vicinity of like at least, it's like between 70 and 85% intensity with like somewhere around 30 reps per workout. So like really heavy, really high volume relative to a lot of other programs, right? It's like you're probably stuck at like RPE 8 to 10 the entire week. And that's week 1. So anyways, he gives this program by percentages to this lady, and she unknowingly, now granted, this is a good example of the, everyone's a little bit different, right? Everyone's is gonna be different as far as like when you prescribe an intensity to somebody, it might be much easier or much harder for someone. She did the entire program in 1 day.
Wow.
Did all of the sets and reps in 1 day.
No.
And was like, yeah. But so you understand, right? And she's like, that was a lot of reps, Rob. Like that was really hard. And so but it's a great example of like that. She just did it because like her squat was probably like 40 kilos.
Yeah.
And like she maybe could squat 70. So like to her it was just like very untrained, like really had no like didn't know it was weird, just was like, oh, okay, I guess I do all of these things, and did the entire program in a single day. She must have been in the gym for like 2 hours. But the point being, what you were talking about as far as like being able to just say like, you could give somebody an insane amount of volume, all of your program in 1 day. Yeah, it's happened. It's happened.
Yeah, and it's bad, right? I mean, that's just like that's an ineffective program. So
she squatted 300 kilos the next day.
The very next day.
She squatted.
In between every set, she actually had
300.
No, in between every set, she actually
did
had
a protein. 16 protein shakes. It's an 8-hour squat workout.
I smell an ebook coming, Max.
Oh yeah, it's on its way. I'm gonna just shit one out here after this and ChatGPT.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so basically the idea is like, okay, general blocks of training, a lot of variety. As things get more and more similar, because the demands of weightlifting become very much the same. I mean, you're trying to peak 2 specific lifts on a given day. Everything starts to converge, and we see a lot of similarity. If we want to think more specifically to round this episode of the podcast out, could you almost create an example training week, just running through it in your head, a base training week for a specific block of training? Maybe you can even give a nod to like frequencies, intensities, exercises, just something where people can start to generate some ideas of, am I closer or farther away from doing this correctly?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I would say like the most obvious thing here is, one, we have 2 distinct goals in, our let's just call it a peaking phase or a competition phase, right? We have two distinct goals. One is to decay fatigue. So any fatigue that's accumulated that is still lingering with us, we want to decay that, which means that we have to have a general progression of reductions in training load, right? Whether that's from, the possible places that could come from are a reduction in intensity or a reduction in volume or a, a roundabout way of that, a reduction in density, meaning that we remove workouts and space them further apart. Um, if we look at each one of those options, some of them make more sense. A reduction in intensity would be negating our second goal, which is to increase exposure to specific work. So we don't want to reduce intensity as a means of decaying fatigue during the peaking phase. Doesn't make sense. We do want to reduce volume. So we have to have a minimum amount of volume that's going to both retain skills. So in weightlifting, it's probably significantly more than in something like powerlifting. You could probably get away squatting once or twice a week still. Whereas in weightlifting, you're probably going to snatch at least almost every session, maybe, 4 out of 5 sessions or 3 out of 4 sessions in a week. Clean and jerk similarly. So you have to maintain those skills. So reduction in volume is necessary if we're going to keep exposure to those exercises high. A reduction in density, meaning spacing the workouts further apart or reducing workouts but making them slightly larger, right, isn't the best for weightlifting, because what that's going to do is remove a constant exposure to the technical elements. So you take a session or two of snatch and clean jerk out during the week, maybe not so bad, but you're definitely going to have a little bit less of that finite feeling of how good and crisp your technique is, right? You're going to want to have that exposure as often as possible. So the most obvious method here to decay fatigue, our first goal, is to reduce volume, have a systematic progressive reduction in training volume going from the beginning of this block to the competition date. The degree to which we decay that fatigue, that volume, is different for everybody, right? It's not going to necessarily be, a linear, 20% week after week, or whatever. It could be that a smaller, younger, female athlete might have a very small decay, 5% week to week, and then a quick, 25% drop the 7 days before the competition. A larger lifter, that might be a 10% decrease week to week, and then, a 30% drop the week of the competition. So those rates of decay can be different for each person, and it's based on who the person is, but there are definite, heuristics that you could say are going to be more applicable. I don't think Lasha is going to decay, his fatigue as in a short a time as someone like, a 49 kilo, female who's just started weightlifting. She may have a 5% drop or maybe no decay in volume and just go right into the competition because she's so inexperienced and so new. So that's the first sort of principle and process we have to think about when building that kind of training block. What are we doing? What's our goal? It's decay fatigue. We know the number one route to that is to reduce volume because it satisfies all requirements for our second goal, which is to give to maximize our skill in the competition lifts. And that means that we have to expose ourselves to high intensity lifts that replicate the sport as closely as possible, which means we're going to do heavy snatches and clean and jerks. We're going to do some heavy squat, bench, or deadlift. And then, whatever other sports they do, whatever you do in korfball or bandy or netball, you're going to do that. So with this being said, in weightlifting, that increase in exposure to 90% plus lifts is going to have to basically follow an inverse kind of situation that the volume does. So as we reduce volume, we've now reduced the amount of fatigue that, is cumulative. We can increase and expose ourselves to more high intensity lifts, more 90% lifts. The benefit of doing this, we know from one, anecdotal sources, we've seen this happen, but also we know from what we've seen, research that came out of the Soviet Union as far as studying the pre-competition phase, an increase in the number of 90% lifts in that last month before competition does have a very strong correlation to your results at the competition. I think that's just an obvious thing, right? So we move from, let's say, the first week of that program being relatively high volume because we just came off of our special preparatory phase, but we're not necessarily super good with 90% or high intensity lifts because we haven't necessarily spent a lot of time focusing solely on those. We would start to add in more attempts at 90% and above. This is, in my opinion, in this phase, the point in time where it's okay to be pushing towards PRs, where you might take 2 or 3 shots at a personal record in weightlifting. Powerlifting, you should never really miss because, it's those movements are so simple. Technically, you can't fuck them up. From a technique standpoint, right? I mean, you could misgroove your squat, obviously, but it's largely going to be just an output thing. So, in weightlifting, you're going to be decaying volume. You drop some volume off. Now you're starting to ramp up the number of 90% lifts. You're starting to incorporate them more. You're starting to maybe incorporate in a week's time frame, maybe one session that week that is a max out session, right? Where you give yourself, I would say, if there's a minimum threshold for a successful lift, let's say you have to be about 85 to 90% accurate technically to make the lift, you could try lifts that maybe are just below that 90% accuracy, meaning that the lift itself is almost there. It's close. Let's say your personal record's 100 and you're trying 102 and you're like missing it, but you're missing it in a way that potentially you could make it if you pushed yourself a little bit harder or were a little more aggressive or connected better or, turned it over better. So we're on the border of where normally we would say you're outside that threshold of making your technique better. This is a place where it's okay to have a little bit of fuzziness there to sort of give yourself exposure to lifts that are very heavy. You're going to be putting yourself in a similar situation in competition, most likely, where you have to reach to make a lift that's going to win you the meet or get you the placing you need, right? Or finally your dad's going to come home from the grocery store, with that pack of menthols that he said he was going to grab 20 years ago. So you want to be in a spot where that you're able to push yourself outside that comfort zone, but not in a way where it's being an asshole, right? And you just keep missing and missing and missing, and you're getting nowhere, and the lifts are getting worse. So I'm saying this from the perspective that it's not, peaking does not mean max out every single week. It means we give ourselves a calculated amount of time to give ourselves exposure to hard lifts like that, so that we don't go into the competition and, we're prepared kind of like a kitten. Like we don't have no idea what it's like to fight for big lifts. Outside of those types of sessions being incorporated into the program, that last block, we want to incorporate a basically like solidifying kind of training that is exposure to high intensity lifts, so we can increase the number of 90% lifts as we progress this block, but in a way that we're developing as good of technical skills as possible, right? So we're doing classic snatch, classic clean and jerk as intended on the platform, 90% and above. The final piece of this is that volume should also incorporate whatever technical elements we need in the program, like we talked about before, to maintain those skills. That could be a separate session where you have like a no hook, no feet, or a hang snatch, or some power position snatch, something that's highly skill focused. It's concentrated on certain technical elements you need to practice, but it's done either separately in another workout, or it's done as a primer or as a complex. So if you have trouble turning the bar over and catching it low, you might incorporate, within those 90% sessions, a power position snatch plus a snatch, or a hang snatch plus a snatch, or at least you pool that up in the earlier parts of that workout. So you have a few complexes, 1+2s. Then you ditch the power position snatch and you move into the classics. So that's just like a very broad overview of like, think of these kinds of session types. You've got big, heavy max out sessions that give you exposure to what it's like to compete with heavy weights and put pressure on yourself and push yourself outside of your current state. A lot of volume dedicated to perfecting snatch and clean and jerk with those moderate or heavy moderate lifts, and developing as good a skill as you can in that 90% range. as well as accumulating more volume there. And then additionally incorporated either within those sessions or outside of those sessions, some highly technical skill transfer movements or highly technical movements done in isolation to really hone your skills and hone your abilities. General stuff, squats, pulls, presses, they follow the same suit that you would in, powerlifting. They only exist so much as they are providing a stimulus to maintain that strength, or, in hypertrophy stuff, probably in weightlifting, you could really taper that off. It's really kind of not super impactful. I don't think you're going to like curl your way into a place where you can't snatch and clean and jerk effectively, unless you're, doing the Rich Piana thing. But, for the most part, that stuff stays in only as needed, right? That's my take. That's my hot take. 5 minutes on a peaking block.
Yeah, I think that was actually like 10, but no, that was great.
Yeah, 10 minutes.
That was a fantastic overview, and I think it was great idea generation for me. I know as I'm listening how I'm thinking about my programming, ways I can adjust it, what I could optimize and do better. If people are interested in high level overviews and detailed analyses of the training process, where can they go to find that, Max? Where do we talk about it every Friday?
We talk about it every Friday at Coachlogik, the mentorship group. It is a fantastic place to go and polish up on your technical skills, your coaching skills. You're going to learn a ton. We have sports scientists. We have pretend sports scientists like Josh in there. We've got a ton of great, I would say, possibly the best resource for education, like, from the perspective that we have so many experts that Josh is connected with, as well as so many people who have actually done it, right? We have people that have actually coached at a high level that are participating in the sport, or a lot of sports, that are going to share a ton of information. So it's a super awesome resource. I would highly suggest anyone check it out. The link is going to be obviously here in the bio, but yeah, that's the place to go, bud.
Yeah, that would be Coachlogik. It's the mentorship group. Follow the link. You can catch up with us and watch videos that we have already done, as well as keep up to date with content that will be coming out. And it's a process. It's a product. It's going to keep growing and developing and getting better over time. As far as anything else, if people are interested in remote coaching, if people are interested in finding the right program for them, Max, where can they go?
Yeah, you can check out teamada.com if you have remote coaching from myself. If you're interested in the app, weightlifting.ai, if you're interested in the coaching app, Coachlogik, that platform will be coming out soon. I don't want to give an exact date because I don't know exactly when this is coming out, but we're working hard on it. It's looking pretty awesome. I'm very excited for it, so keep your eyes open. It'll be out soon.
Yeah, that sounds great. And if you want to follow us on Instagram, that's Josh_Phil WL, that's PHILWL, Max_Ada. All the other accounts you can find if you just click a link here and there and do some work on your end. And we will catch, well, this is your podcast, Max. Maybe you should take us out.
You can take us out. You're almost there. You're almost there.
Yeah, thanks for listening, guys.
Okay, we'll see you guys later. This is a Coachlogik podcast. Thanks for listening.